Today we know from multiple sources that Saddam has ordered that any scientist who cooperates during interviews will be killed, as well as their families. Furthermore, we know that scientists are being tutored on what to say to the UN inspectors, and that Iraqi intelligence officers are posing as scientists to be interviewed by the inspectors. And finally, of course, there's obstruction, and obstruction concealed by lying. In the past, UN inspectors faced many instances of delay, with excuses that ranged from "we can't find the keys" to "you can't come in here because only women are allowed." When all else fails, lying becomes a standard technique. Richard Butler, the former head of the UN Special Commission, reported, and I quote, "Iraqi leaders had no difficulty sitting across from me and spontaneously changing a reported fact or figure. For example," he said, 6 previously reported warheads could suddenly become 15, or vice versa, with no explanation or apology about a previous lie. Butler reports that actions taken to obstruct inspectors were often explained away with excuses that were as credible as "the dog ate my homework." One example that Butler quotes, literally, "A wandering psychopath cut some wires to the chemical plant monitoring camera. It seems he hadn't received the medicine he needed because of the UN sanctions." And here's another. "The wicked girlfriend of one of our workers tore up the documents in anger." During the UNSCOM period, Richard Spurzel on one occasion confronted Dr. Rehab Taha, still a principal and sinister figure in Iraq's biological weapons program, said to her, I quote, "Dr. Taha, you know that we know that you're lying, so why are you doing it?" Dr. Taha drew herself up and replied, "Dr. Spurzel, it is not a lie when you are ordered to lie." Lying was more than a technique. It was, and it remains, a policy. Today, Iraqi obstruction continues on large issues as well as small ones. Authorities that Resolution 1441 confers unconditionally on the inspectors are constantly subject to conditions by the Baghdad regime. For example, the resolution requires that the UN inspectors shall have, quote, "free and unrestricted use and landing of fixed and rotary winged aircraft, including manned and unmanned reconnaissance vehicles," unquote. But Iraq has objected to U-2 flights and shoots at our predators. Even more serious, Iraq has yet to make a single one of its scientists or technical experts available to be interviewed in confidential circumstances, free of intimidation, as required by the UN resolution. Long ago, Iraq became accustomed to the fact that even when caught, the consequences could be negligible, and hence a new game entered the lexicon: cheat and retreat. This happened on issue after issue. For example, as Butler reports, I'm quoting again, "Initially, Iraq had denied ever having manufactured, let alone deployed VX, but this was not true. Confronted with evidence of VX in soil samples, the Iraqis then admitted they'd manufactured, but claimed a quantity of no more than 200 liters. Subsequent probing showed they'd made far more. So Iraq's initial complete lie had been replaced by a false statement about the quantity. Iraq then reached for a third lie. They'd never weaponized VX. This, it turned out, was yet a third falsehood. That same pattern was repeated with Iraq's nuclear and biological weapons. Baghdad revised its nuclear declaration to the IAEA 4 times within 14 months of the initial submission in April 1991. During the UNSCOM period, Iraq submitted 6 different biological warfare declarations, each one of which the UN inspectors rejected. Following the defection of Saddam's son-in-law, Hussein Kamal, Iraq dramatically disclosed more than 500,000 pages of biological weapons-related documents. But in fact, sparse, relevant information was buried within a massive volume of extraneous data, all of which was intended to create the appearance of candor and to overwhelm the UN inspectors' analytical resources. A process that begins with a massive lie and proceeds with concealment, penetration, intimidation, and obstruction cannot be a process of cooperative disarmament. The purpose of Resolution 1441, I repeat, was not to play a deadly game of hide and seek or cheat and retreat for another 12 years. The purpose was to achieve a clear resolution of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass terror. If Iraq were to choose to comply with the requirement to dismantle its weapons of mass terror, we would know it. We would know it from their full and complete declaration of everything that we know that they have, as well as by revelations of programs that our intelligence has probably not yet discovered. Recall that after the Gulf War, we were stunned by the magnitude of Iraq's nuclear program, despite all of our intelligence efforts and those of our allies, including Israel, and even though Iraq had been subject to IAEA inspections for many years. We would know it if we saw an attitude on the part of the Iraqi government that encouraged people to cooperate with inspectors rather than intimidated them into silence and lies. We would know it when inspectors were able to go about their work without being spied on or penetrated. And we would know it, most of all, when Iraqi scientists and others familiar with the program were clearly speaking freely. But in the absence of full cooperation, particularly in the absence of full disclosure of what Iraq has actually done, we cannot expect that the UN inspectors have the capacity to disarm an uncooperative Iraq, even with the full support of American intelligence and the intelligence of other nations. American intelligence capabilities are extraordinary, but they are far from the omniscient, all-seeing eye depicted in some Hollywood movies. For a great body of what we need to know, we are dependent on traditional methods of intelligence, that is to say, human beings who either deliberately or inadvertently are communicating to us. It was only after Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, Hussein Kamal, defected in 1995 that UN inspectors were led to a large cache of documents on a chicken farm that contained important revelations about Iraq's biological weapons. In contemplating the magnitude of the task of finding such hidden sites, one might ask, how many farms are there in Iraq? How many structures are there in which important documents could be stored? How many garages in that big country are large enough to hold the tractor trailers that make up an Iraqi mobile biological weapons factory? And we need to be worried. Even when inspectors were in Iraq before, the Baghdad regime was building and retaining weapons of mass terror. It would be folly to think that those efforts stopped when the inspectors left. Consider that in 1997, UN inspectors found Iraq had produced and weaponized at least 10 liters of ricin. In concentrated form, that quantity of ricin is enough to kill more than 1 million people. Baghdad declared to the UN inspectors that it had over 19,000 liters of botulinum toxin, enough to kill tens of millions, and 8,500 liters of anthrax with the potential to kill hundreds of millions. And consider that the UN inspectors believed that much larger quantities of biological agents remained undeclared. Indeed, the inspectors think that Iraq has manufactured 2 to 4 times the amount of biological agents it had admitted to, and has failed to explain the whereabouts of more than 2 metric tons of raw material for the growth of biological agents. Despite 11 years of inspections and sanctions, containment and military response, Baghdad retains chemical and biological weapons and is producing more. And Saddam's nuclear scientists are still hard at work. As the president put it, and I quote, "The history, the logic, and the facts lead to one conclusion. Saddam Hussein's regime is a grave and gathering danger. To suggest otherwise is to hope against the evidence. To assume the regime's good faith is to bet the lives of millions and the peace of the world in a reckless gamble. And this is a risk we must not take." So we come back to the imperative. Baghdad must disarm, peacefully if at all possible, but by force if necessary. The decision on whether Iraq's weapons of mass terror will be dismantled voluntarily or whether it will have to be done by force is not up to us, it is not up to the inspectors, it is not up to the United Nations. The decision rests entirely with Saddam Hussein. So far, he has not made the fundamental decision to disarm, and unless he does, the threat posed by his weapons programs will remain with us, and indeed it will grow. Yes, there are real dangers in confronting a tyrant who has and uses weapons of mass terror and has links to terrorists. But those dangers will only grow. They are far greater now than they would have been 5 or 10 years ago, and they will be much greater still 5 or 10 years from now. President Bush has brought the world to an extraordinary consensus and focus on this problem. It is time to see it resolved, voluntarily or by force, but resolved one way or another, and time is running out. On a happier note, if one thinks about it, once freed from Saddam's tyranny, it is reasonable to expect that Iraq's educated, industrious population of more than 20 million could build a modern society that would be a source of prosperity, not insecurity, for its neighbors. Barham Saleh, a very brave and distinguished Iraqi Kurdish leader, it's important to make it clear we have a powerful case. It is a case grounded in history. It is a case grounded in current intelligence that comes not only from American intelligence, but many of our allies, intelligence that comes not only from sophisticated overhead satellites and our ability to intercept communications, but from brave people who've told us the truth at the risk of their lives. We have that. It is very convincing. At some point, we can probably talk about more of it, but right now, time is running out. It is time for Saddam Hussein to do something that he clearly hasn't done yet, and it is the essential solution to this problem. I don't know, that would sort of require me to speculate about motives, and you get in trouble when you do that. I think one of the problems with a lot of people is a well-intentioned belief that the key to preventing war is to persuade us that we mustn't act. And the key, in fact, here, to achieving the one alternative to war, which is cooperative disarmament, is to persuade Saddam Hussein that he must act. So I would say whatever the intentions of our allies, and I believe they agree with us completely that he has these weapons, I would hope they put more effort into persuading Saddam Hussein than into persuading us. I think the short answer, Michael, really is there is a lot of evidence. The evidence accumulates. Our ability to talk about it undoubtedly will grow. But we don't have a lot of time. Time is running out, and I repeat, what is clearly not happened is any change of attitude by the Iraqi regime. Yeah, it's possible that we've been misinformed on some things. The only way to verify that you've been misinformed is with the kind of openness that the South Africans or the Ukrainians or the Kazakhs demonstrated. If you could go into places and talk freely to people and look at all the records, you might be convinced. But in a country that has a history of constructing Potemkin villages, there's absolutely no way to know whether what the inspectors were shown were indeed those aluminum tubes that we're concerned about, or whether it was a whole facade constructed to substantiate a certain story. So you've got to look at Iraq's behavior toward the inspectors. You've got to look at Iraq's intimidation of its scientists. These efforts to obstruct are very, very clear signs of Iraq's intentions, just as 12 years of foregoing what are estimated to be $100 billion to $200 billion of oil revenues in order to not comply with UN resolutions are a sign of their policy.